one.
Politics and doing it in a way that is, as I had mentioned, fully neutral. And so we have no positions here at the channel itself. It's just we want to have the speakers come, make their case, and then you, the audience, can decide who you find more persuasive. Or who knows, maybe it'll be a tie for the first time. I don't know. But very excited. We really do want to let you know no matter what walk of life you're from, we really hope you feel welcome here. And so with that, I am going to give you a quick layout of the format, and then I'm going to ask if the speakers can give a brief introduction as well as share about what you can find at their links in the description, which are already there if you want to check them out. And so for that format, it's going to be pretty short and sweet, pretty
What
simple.
up, what up?
Basically, roughly 15 minutes if the speakers need it for their opening statements, followed by 60 minutes
Got a
of open
blueberry muffin for
dialogue, and then
breakfast.
about 30 minutes of Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to fire it into the old live chat. We'll get through as many as we can, but no promises as we do want to respect the debaters' time as well. So with that, I want to say thanks so much to our guests. We really do appreciate you guys being here. And so we'll start with Ben, who's on the left side of your screen, folks. And so Ben, thrilled to have you back. It's been quite a while. And so if you'd like to share what people can find at your link as well as about yourself, thanks for being here with us.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to come onto the program. It's been wonderful to get to talk with Matt a little here in sort of the pre-debate conversation and getting to know you. You can find information about my ministry at benfisherministries.com, and in particular, technology, as well as some of the things that I'll be presenting tonight. You can just visit me online at howtodefeatskepticism.com, and we'd love to be able to connect with some of the resources that the ministry has to offer.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Ben. The listeners all are. So we'll kick it over to Matt. Glad to have you back, Matt. I think it was back in August.
Season, as a matter of fact.
So
it is.
A bit chillier now. So thrilled to have you back. If you'd like to share about your as well as about yourself. Thanks so much for being back.
Glad to be here. Worked out. I noticed you have the YouTube link to my personal account, which is the Atheist Faith Project. I'm Matt Doherty. I am the host for the past 15-ish years of the Atheist Experience, a call-in show. By the Atheist Community of Boston, I am a two-time president of the organization, not that that matters at all. And in addition to hosting the Atheist Experience, I also host a show on the Line Network called The Hang Up, where, because I'm not working for a nonprofit, I get to be as political and outrageous as I might want to be, where I can't, but I'm actually working for a nonprofit. So I'm glad we got tech issues sorted, and I'm thrilled to be here to have a conversation with Ben, who, I mean, literally I knew nothing about until we got into the pre-show, but we had a little quick back and forth, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this goes and trying to have a good conversation about really good evidence for God.
I was like, no, never even
Absolutely. I'm optimistic. I think it's going to be a great conversation. And so with that, we will get the ball rolling. I've got the timer set for you guys. And the floor is all yours for your opening statement.
Like this?
Okay. Well, I first want to start off by saying that I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to come onto the program this evening. So thanks to Modern Day Debate for folding me into their schedule. And as well as special thanks to Matt Delahunty for being part of tonight's discussion. Certainly looking forward to a robust exchange of ideas. Now, in our debate, I'm going to be making two main contentions. Number one, philosophical, and therefore religious skepticism is now a soundly defeated argument within secular academia, and that number two, theism, has a number of strong arguments in its favor. So I'm looking forward to presenting both arguments tonight and offering various reasons in their defense. But for my opening statement, I'm going to be explaining why religious skepticism is now a soundly refuted argument, as this will add strength to my later arguments for God's existence in our open discussion time. So let's first begin by setting the stage on what caused the problem of skepticism to first become such an issue within Western civilization to begin with. Skepticism essentially broke onto the scene of Western history at a time when ancient Greek philosophers were starting to become prolific in asking questions. Questions like, how do we know anything? Can we know anything? And if we can't know anything, what is the method for knowing it? Well, other questions were asked which were aimed at even more fundamental issues, such as, what is knowledge to begin with? Is it something that we can define? And if we can define it, what are the necessary characteristics of it? Well, amid the sea of swirling questions, there were two main inquiries which emerged that drew the most attention from early Greek philosophers. And they were, one, what is knowledge? And two, how do we get it? Now, the first question was considered for some centuries to have been decisively answered by the early Greek philosopher Plato, who held that knowledge contained three essential ingredients to it: truth, proof, and belief. Truth, proof, and belief. And so it seems that for Plato, there simply had to be something more to knowledge than a person's mere belief that something was true, joined together with the fact that it was actually right. Instead, there needed to be some sort of proof or justification for that belief. And so thus, according to Plato, justification was the needed ingredient to properly bracket truth and belief together under knowledge. And for centuries, most philosophers just thought that Plato was right. Almost no one questioned his views. But in 1963, there was an American philosopher by the name of Edmund Gettier who published a brief paper which seemed to challenge Plato's classical definition of knowledge. Using a set of counterexamples, Gettier was able to demonstrate that Plato's definition had really been incomplete all along. Instead, it was possible, said Gettier, for a person to believe something which was true and to have a reasonable justification for that belief without that belief necessarily counting as knowledge. And the result of Gettier's paper was a tremendous upheaval amongst modern philosophers to identify what had been missing from Plato's classical definition. Precisely what was it? Was it warrant? Was it vindication? Was it something else no one had ever thought of before? No one was able to say. Now, of course, the reason why this was such a problem for modern philosophers is that unless we could have a working definition for knowledge, we could have no assurance on how to get it. And so it's therefore a somewhat comical joke of Western academia that today no one has ever offered a convincing reply to Edmund Gettier. So, in response to our first question, no, modern philosophers don't really know how to define knowledge. So then what about the second question? Well, the second question is, how do we get knowledge? Now, for most of us, this is probably the more relevant issue by far to tonight's discussion. How do we decide, for example, that we really know that God exists? Is there some sort of a rational way to settle a question like that? Well, classically, skeptics have argued, again, probably due to Plato's influence, that it's impossible for human beings to know anything. Now, while the mere mention of that idea tends to elicit roaring laughter from some people, this is nevertheless a belief which has historically been immensely successful. The reason is that it seems to be based on a principle which virtually all philosophers agree is true, called the closure principle. And the closure principle essentially states that in the case of any pair of opposing claims, if we know that one is true, we also know the other is false. And so for this reason, the skeptic's argument winds up looking surprisingly good as we go about the business of simply minding our P's and Q's. Observe, if I know that P is true, I also know that Q is false. I cannot know that Q is false, therefore I cannot know that P is true. Now notice that we're already beginning to see here the very core inspiration for religious skepticism taking shape. So if you don't see it yourself, simply watch what happens when we restate the argument like this. If I know that Christianity is true, I know Hinduism is false. I can't know Hinduism is false, therefore I cannot know that Christianity is true. And so for this reason, we can see that skeptics do not succeed in defending their views if they insist on arguing that religious skepticism is somehow very different from philosophical skepticism. Obviously, that's not true. The two arguments derive from precisely one and the same basic classical form. Well, moving on, the argument of skepticism has obviously been enormously powerful throughout its time. Almost no one in history has ever been able to soundly refute it. But through an unexpected series of events, probably triggered mostly by Edmund Gettier, the chief premise of the argument was actually brought into question. And this occurred as another American philosopher by the name of Robert Nozick set about trying to repair Plato's original definition of knowledge. And what happened next inadvertently became the basis for refuting skepticism. So here's how Nozick did it. First, let's look at the most vivid example of skepticism which has ever been conceived. It's a story film depiction of the now infamous Brain in the Bad Argument. The movie was released in 1999 by the famous film director duo, the Wachowski brothers, and it later went on to become their biggest smash hit. The film was entitled The Matrix, and it told the story of a man who was suddenly unplugged from a computer, only to discover that up until the present time, his entire life had been nothing but a dream. Well, the film portrays the struggles of the character named Neo to adjust to the world as it actually is. His life lived as a brain in a vat had deceived him regarding the true nature of his existence. Sentient machines had cleverly wired his cerebrum to stimulate his brain to accept his false experiences. And of course, this only raised the question for most moviegoers, how can we be certain that the Matrix does not exist? Well, naturally, few of us tended to be detained by the Matrix question for very long. Most of us probably dealt with it by shrugging our shoulders and simply having a sandwich. But for Nozick, stories like The Matrix proved an extremely invaluable point, namely, that the argument of skepticism is baseless. To see why Nozick thought that, try imagining the following fanciful scenario. What would have happened if the machines themselves had decided to tell Neo that his body lay embedded in a tube of biodegradable goop? That's, of course, assuming that machines can decide to do anything. Well, getting back to the point, if this had happened, Neo would immediately be in a position to know that the real world lay somewhere beyond his current empirical borders, correct? But the question which naturally follows is, does this count as knowledge? The problem was that under Plato's classical definition, it did. In fact, this point becomes all too easy for us to see as we simply reconsider Plato's original criterion for knowledge alongside the present case under discussion. Consider, number one, belief. Plato said we need belief to have knowledge. Well, did Neo believe the machine? By supposition, we're saying he did. Number two, truth. We need to have truth to have knowledge. Well, was the machine story true? Yes, Neo was plugged into a computer. Three, justification. Was Neo's belief justified? Well, the machine was the one who told him. But the question which remained is, does that count as knowledge? Does it? Well, our hesitation to answer yes, said Nozick, was a sign that something was wrong here. Recall here that Gettier had argued previously that something was missing from Plato's classical definition of knowledge. Scenarios like this one seem to show that Gettier was right, but that wasn't all that they seemed to show. Instead, they also purportedly pointed to the need for a new criterion for knowledge. In other words, they seem to show that the canonical rule of P not Q is not a reliable method. For Neo could readily affirm that he was in the Matrix, that's P, as well as that his senses were deceiving him, that's Q. The problem was that Neo's awareness of this wasn't due to his personally sensing it. Therefore, the rule of P not Q cannot be true, supposedly to lead us to knowledge.
Why I smell like that?
Now, at this point, it's probably important. Similar, this is to some of the most common gripes the atheist says to the Christian.
No, I smell it.
Christianity is true. Well, to this, the simple yes, but God told me Christianity is true. Therefore, all religions must be false.
Yeah, but when I put it out the bag, I was like,
to the very case
when I put it all the way out, I was like, this ain't
consider. In the Christian's case, the Holy Spirit tells the Christian that his faith is true. That's P. While in the Matrix case, the computer tells Neo that he's sleeping in the Matrix.
Okay.
Next,
I don't know how
on
you
the
can't
basis
smell.
of
I
this, the
smell
Christian
it.
concludes that
Even
all
when
of
it's
the
right
faiths
here,
are
I
false.
smell it.
That's not Q. While in the Matrix case, Neo concludes that his senses are deceiving him. Once again, not Q. Now, in both examples, notice that the test subject has failed to personally sense his knowledge of P. Instead, he's merely been told that P is true. Therefore, even if it is the case that P is true and therefore Q is false, we've nevertheless failed to close the subject's knowledge of P to further question. Instead, we've allegedly discovered that P is now unknowable. Unfortunately, this argument has actually aroused deep suspicion from most modern philosophers, for the argument leads to the immediate implosion of the closure principle, if P then Q. Because of this, the majority of contemporary epistemologists have concluded that Robert Nozick had committed a critical error. By claiming that our knowledge of P must be personally sensed, Nozick had accidentally eviscerated the closure principle. And the result of this mistake was that it made it impossible to claim that Q could somehow be implied from P. Instead, Nozick had shown that our knowledge of P must be acquired sensitively. Without intending to do so, Nozick had actually undermined the primitive logical basis for evidence of almost any kind. Because without the closure principle, our logical basis for legal evidence, philosophical evidence, and even scientific evidence becomes destroyed. And because of this, most modern philosophers reject Nozick's arguments. Our knowledge of P does not need to be sensitively acquired. Instead, philosophers agree that Nozick's sensitivity requirement is simply false. Therefore, the argument of religious skepticism has been dismantled. So with this in mind, let's view the religious skeptic's model argument and see for ourselves how this begins to affect things. If I know that Christianity is true, I know all other religions are false. I can't know all other religions are false, therefore I can't know that Christianity is true. Now, as we consider that argument, it's obvious the entire abstraction turns on the second premise. In other words, premise 2 is the central premise which directly determines the outcome for the skeptic's argument. The question is it really true that we can't know that all religions in the world are false? To answer yes, usually insists the reason we can't know this, that all religions are false, is because we're not in a position to personally sense it. For example, consider, we can't see spiritual things. These sorts of realities are simply not empirically beholden to us. Therefore, we can't know that all religions in the world are false, or so the skeptic claims. But the problem is that we've just seen that making sensitivity a requirement for knowledge causes the rule of P not Q, if this not this, to fail to lead us to knowledge. Therefore, by defending the second premise of his argument in this way, the skeptic has actually imploded the first premise, which is just simply unsubstantiation.
Y'all got a motherfucking, like a legit, a peg leg, yo, like a pirate.
So at this point, if you can't see why this
pirate out
is
this shit, yo. Nothing gonna hold me down, man. Gotta get around, gotta do shit.
That
So
virtually all arguments from religious skepticism
upgrade to
tacitly
the peg
assume
leg.
Gnostic sensitivity requirement is a necessary requirement for religious knowledge. So to see how encompassing to this point really is, let me take my final 2 minutes to follow up on a few other arguments that are like this. Consider this additional argument on Bible certainty. If I know the Bible is reliable, I know that Constantine never destroyed early editions. I cannot know that Constantine never destroyed early editions. Therefore, I cannot know that the Bible is reliable. Now, atheists often view Emperor Constantine as the one who founded the Catholic Church by forcing its bishops into theological agreement. And it's sometimes alleged that one of the ways that he did this was by burning early editions of the Bible that differed from his theological vision of the Church. Sadly, this argument is still widely talked about across the atheist internet, from my understanding. But the problem with this is that the second premise of the argument plainly assumes Gnostic sensitivity requirement, once again, as a necessary condition for religious knowledge. Think about it. Can we sensibly, that is by use of our senses, know that Constantine never burned early editions of the Bible? Well, of course not. And why not? Because our belief that Constantine didn't do this isn't empirically verifiable. But by making this a requirement for knowing the Bible is reliable, this actually implodes the first premise of the argument if P not Q, if this not this, which also invalidates the conclusion. Therefore, the very basis of the argument is undermined and the conclusion vanquished. Presto. One more argument. If I know that Jesus was bodily raised, I know that natural explanations to Easter are false. I cannot know that all natural explanations to Easter are false. Therefore, I cannot know that Jesus was bodily raised. Now, atheists often claim that the resurrection of Jesus is naturally explainable. Maybe the Romans tossed the body of Jesus into a mass grave. Maybe the disciples stole it. Or maybe even one of 100 other natural possibilities shows why the body went missing. But because the evidence for the case can't be empirically accessed, we can't sensibly falsify these numerous counter-explanations, and so therefore we can't know that Jesus was raised.
a little hand rest, so I can lean extra hard.
But the problem is that, once again, that the second premise of the argument plainly assumes Gnostic sensitivity requirement as a necessary condition for knowledge. Once again, think about it.
It's basically like a temporary prosthetic. Yeah.
Of course not. And why not?
But it's a brilliant fucking design. Whoever designed this shit, I know that motherfucker rich as hell off of this shit.
If alternatives are unsatisfactory, isn't sensitive. But by making this a requirement for knowing Jesus was bodily raised, the first premise in the argument of P not Q is once again invalidated. Therefore, the very basis of the argument is destroyed and the argument vanquished. So we see, therefore, that we have 3 very good reasons, these 3 models, to show that religious skepticism doesn't work. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand the mic over to our moderator to go ahead and take the show from here. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you very much, Ben, for that opening statement. We will kick it over to Matt.
And I don't walk up
Matt.
and downstairs with this shit on. You gotta go downstairs backwards because how your foot hangs off the edge. Like if you went down.
I'm gonna set my.
If you try to go down forward,
I'm kind of free.
Of course, your foot will hit the step behind you.
And I'll start by saying.
But if you just walk down the stairs backwards, it works just fine.
Presenting an argument or evidence, there's some structure to the.
If I designed it, I would have put the.
And while we're not actually.
This is like at the platform for the calf is almost at a 90-degree angle. I would have actually angled it down a little further so you have a little bit more clearance space. Like if your foot was down a little more,
which is that I tried
to make it narrower
as carefully as I could.
Instead of having this
and I heard
fucking
nothing at all
90-degree angle, you can have like a fucking
that presented any evidence
75-degree angle here.
Good or otherwise.
Have more clearance for your
It seemed
foot.
to be a dissertation on problems with justified true belief which I have problems with as well. So, I mean, it would be nice if we would
it
just
works,
agree
though.
from the outset that, hey, I don't use justified true belief as my definition of knowledge because of various problems. Might have saved some time, but there's a bunch of objections about religious skepticism, but nothing at all about modern scientific skepticism, which I happen to also apply to religion. So showing that religious skepticism isn't sufficient, which I'm not sure that he did, is irrelevant. Religious skepticism could be complete garbage as an epistemology, and literally nothing Ben said goes anywhere close to evidence for a God. As a matter of fact, after potentially strawmanning religious skepticism, or my position, which isn't what he talked about, we got in the final 2 minutes some notes on what atheists might say about Constantine enforcing belief, and none of those things are evidence for existence of God. And so what I'm talking about, and it's a really difficult thing, because people are generally, when they're talking about how do we know what we know, I'm more interested in why do we believe what we believe? Are our beliefs warranted? I don't care if they rise to the level where somebody calls them knowledge. For me, knowledge generally is a belief held to such a high degree of confidence that it would be worldview altering to find that it's wrong. But I don't care about that, because we're not here to debate, do we know that a God exists, or do we know that no God exists? What we're asking is there a justified, evidence-based belief that a God exists? I haven't seen it. When I take a look at what evidence we might consider, if there's good evidence, first of all, I would argue, and this is a really bad argument, I'm saying it's a bad argument at the outset, but evidence for God, I would know. And I don't say that in any sort of arrogance about who I am or anything else. Yes, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've spent the bulk of my life studying it, and I've done countless debates with people, and I've had people present arguments and evidence. What I'm saying is, if in fact there were good evidence for a God, we would all know that this would be Noah Prize worthy. This would be in the news. Hell, the news reports things that they don't even have good evidence for. Certainly, if we had good evidence for something, this would be newsworthy. There would be no more debates. And yet the truth is, we live in a world where we can't get people to agree on things that are actually factual and determined and demonstrable. I mean, like facts about climate change. Do we know all of it? No. But there are some people who pretend that this isn't even happening. What about evolution? Evolution is an observable, demonstrable fact. The theory by which we would explain evolution is a scientific theory, a model. Talk about the efficacies of vaccines, how they actually do work, and how they
social
don't
media
cause
messages.
autism. We can't even necessarily convince people that the
cool
Earth isn't
funny
flat,
news out
and
there
that
right
their
now.
experiences that they think are real with regard to ghosts and aliens probably are not. That merely their personal experience or their interpretation of events aren't necessarily justified. Things that we know, there are things that we believe and have strong evidence for, or other things. Good evidence lead to a false conclusion. This time we had good evidence that the sun orbited the Earth. We know now that that's not wrong. Did that evidence stop being good? That what happened is that evidence that we would use to reach that conclusion was found to still be good evidence, just incomplete. We didn't have a complete model, and new information turned it on its head. We got better evidence. It was reasonable to conclude that the sun went around the Earth, even though it wasn't true. You can have a reasonably justified belief that's independent of whether it's true. And I think we spent the entire opening kind of trashing a version of skepticism that isn't mine and talking about problems with knowledge that isn't relevant to this. I'd really like to find out, is there good evidence for a God, for the existence of God? And if there is
there
what
good
is that
evidence?
evidence? Just saying, well, you can't justify knowledge is irrelevant. I don't care about knowledge. I'm not claiming about knowledge. Wouldn't even expect Ben to say he knows that there's a God. He might know. But what I would expect him to say is that he believes this and that he has good reason for it. And what is the good reason? I don't know. So when we gather the available facts that you're trying to explain, and you look at the explanation, the best explanations tend to fit all or as many of the facts as possible, and doesn't permit multiple competing explanations with similar conflicting positions. So like if your methodology, if your epistemology, if your test methodology question can result in good evidence for gods, universe creating pixies, and magic, then you haven't got a methodology that distills things down to the most probable truth here. It's not that in that case, your evidence may be decent, but your methodology for assessing it is not particularly good. And this is one thing people will try to say all the time. It's like, oh, well, Talking to Matt is like, you're never going to convince him because he's closed. Well, the truth is, I'm as open-minded as anybody that I've ever met about pretty much anything, provided you can actually present evidence for it. The problem is that what some people think is good evidence for a proposition.
All right, good morning, everybody. If there are any first-time viewers to my channel, I appreciate you guys coming in, checking out Paintings with the Prince. I am the Prince, and I make paintings. That's why it's so easy to find me and remember who I am. It's the Prince who make paintings. Paintings by the Prince. So, of course, got a YouTube channel here. This is my official home studio. This is actually in my house. This is my workspace. This is where I get shit done. But at the same time, I have like a very small production, no cost. I would say low cost, but there is no cost. Well, there is cost, but nobody get paid to do this shit. But anyway, a very small production, like legit official TV show that actually airs on television. It's just on our local TV station. So if you're not in our county and not connected to our local cable networks, then you can't watch it on TV. You can watch it on the internet, but if you live locally, you can actually turn on your television to whatever Comcast channel 19 and watch my show on TV. And we just put out a new episode yesterday, one of the last interviews that I did, and this has been like throughout COVID. Like, I actually recorded several interviews while we were still in this fucking little pandemic crisis. Not add to queue. Why did I? So, once again, just for people who've never seen my show or who haven't been in my YouTube stream here before, so you can see the difference in production. Like, okay, this is me with my fucking stocking cap on, nigga, in my own personal element, chilling. But then you can see the difference in the more technical and professional production that I do. Let's see if we can. Welcome to another episode of ECTV's Roundtable Discussions. I'm your host, Travis Prince, and today our guest is Jenny Matthews. Jenny, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Travis.
Well, thanks for coming to talk to me. The first thing I want to do is have you introduce yourself to our guests and give a little bit of your background in art education and things like that.
Absolutely. My name is Jenny. My students like to call me Miss Jenny because I just think that it's a little bit more special than the formal version. So along with teaching, it will be my 13th year of teaching art. Absolutely love it. It's the best job in the whole wide world. But right now I'm kind of a full-time artist because it's summer break, and I'm really working on my own talents right now. A lot of my animals are poisonous, but the woman, the subject usually, which I do like to have a woman usually, she is just in sync with these creatures, and they're not going to hurt her. Fine, of course. I don't charge hourly, I don't do that. Again, it's more level of difficulty. It's here.
More important to them,
Yes.
what's more valuable to them, what would they rather invest their money into, and art is that thing that is coming up a lot more.
Yeah, it's original. It's
more important to them.
Yes.
What,
It's of acrylics. I have worked in oil for a while. Like when I was in grad school, I did a lot of oil. The reason I do acrylics now is because these pieces travel with me. They're like in my.
That's, yeah, that's so nice. Well, this one right here, I see there's a lot of like luminescence to it, and it has a.
Ooh, I want to put that in my painting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, she was definitely really fun. She had those earrings in. She wanted some dragonflies, and she said she wanted foliage. So just lay it down, and then you start. That initial spark of inspiration is coming towards it.
pages of the piece.
Yeah, it's still very, because like whoever sees it.
There's so much to learn.
Yeah.
Well, I've learned a lot from you and your art today, and I really appreciate you coming to the studio and sitting down and having a conversation with me.
I had a blast, Travis. Thank you. I was looking forward to this. This is great.
Like I said, that's like more of that's the official production, and I wish I could have that level of like precision here in my home studio to make it look a little bit more professional in here, but I would need like help because it takes a few people to do that, to set up with the lights, the sounds, the microphones, the camera, the switching of the cameras, and then once you have all the footage together, like editing that shit down and making sure the light temperatures and measurements are the same. Like it's a good bit that goes into it, and we all do the shit for free. And I just talk, so I just sit there and talk. And so the more technical stuff, which is actually, I would imagine, the more time consuming, is like if I could have like someone who could do my sound and lights in here and make like, I don't know, have a better camera while I'm painting, I would love to do that. But that's like way off in the future. We'll get there where the home studio production is as good as the television studio production. So, really didn't find anything in the news this morning to talk about. You guys got any suggestions? If not, I'll probably just go ahead and get my brushes wet. It is Sunday though. I go back to some more atheist experience. I like to have theological and religious discussions on Sundays, on the Lord's Day, where we all sit down and rest on the Sabbath. This is always interesting.
I don't. You can just say, well, that's just your opinion. And if
I've never said I oppose fracking.
You said it on tape.
I did show the tape. Put it on your website.
I'll put it on.
Would there be any place for...
It's all just your opinion. The problem is...
The old dudes be bickering and arguing
it
back and
only
forth.
seems
Like
to be
neighbors who don't
the
like each
supernatural
other.
and the God.
Show the tape.
And
Put
God
it on your
that
website.
we can't demonstrate, that aren't viable as you acknowledge, and we can't test. This is the place where people come and say, well, you're a skeptic. You just set the bar way too high for God. How could I possibly set the bar way too high for the existence of the single most important entity and fact that could possibly exist? How can my bar be set too high? Because I set a really high bar for a girlfriend. Fortunately, she loves me, and we interact, and I've met her. And you want to tell me that, not you necessarily, Ben, I'm kind of speaking generally, but theists want to tell me that there is a God and he loves me. And yet, I see no evidence of this. I have done all the things I used to believe. I've done the things that people tell me to do, and I've tried. And so all I can do is get to the point where that if in fact there is a God, I have no way of knowing it. Because the arguments that theists give me are things like, look at the trees, or how do you ground morality without a God? Well, who said that there was a grounding for morality in the first place? It's not me. The arguments for the existence of God that have been presented and argued and debated.
That's why I listen to Matt the most, because he makes
flawed. The flaws get pointed out, and the theologians go say, well, there's a God, so let's massage this argument and that's with a different version of it. Today, though, I don't even know, and this is, I don't know,
it's so hard for us to say we don't know. And there's just some things like that we just don't know, no matter how much we feel it or how much we have a personal experience. Like, science can't explain everything and religion can't explain everything. I done seen some shit recently, that shit got me questioning a lot of shit. But at the end of the day, it's just like me, I don't know what the fuck that was. But it's like, I don't know, them hardcore, die-hard religious people who just swear up and down like the Bible is unvaluable. Like, bro, it's a bunch of old ass fucking stories written by people who didn't even have good science.
Ben, I've never met Ben. He seems really nice. But today, though, we didn't get an argument for the existence of God. We didn't get an argument for the evidence for God, which was what I thought we were here to discuss. Instead, we just got, hey, religious skepticism fails to warrant knowledge. And, you know, atheists will say things like Constantine forced religion on people. Well, so what? What is the actual evidence for God? We're looking at things, trying to figure out what's the whole picture. Imagine you're putting together a jigsaw puzzle. Proper 1,000-piece, 5,000-piece, whatever it is, and you pick up two pieces, and your first instinct is that these two pieces seem to fit together. They're a pretty good fit. The colors seem to line up. The pattern seems to line up. It's probably reasonable to assume that these two go together. But for anybody who's done a jigsaw puzzle, with a few exceptions, any sizable jigsaw puzzle, you all know that eventually you're going to get to the point where it's like you put two pieces together that really didn't quite go together. But the more pieces you put to the puzzle, more obvious and easier it becomes to put the final pieces in, because there are fewer and fewer options with each and every step. And it's only when the entirety of the picture is there that you truly can say, yes, this puzzle is done correctly. But at 50%, you can still say, I'm completely confident or 90% confident about this, and I have a reasonable understanding of this.
Yo, King, what's up, bro?
It's not an all or nothing thing. So we have observations, we get the facts, we build a model, we test the model. Is it falsifiable? Is it replicatable?
All right, so this is the next installment of the Reader series, and for the past few days, just been working on the books, really. I took a couple of days to like kind of try to straighten up the lines on the books, get some kind of shading and tonal difference in the books themselves, and the pages at the bottoms of the book, which are casting shadows on the shelf. So just been working on that, and so now I think the books are in a good enough spot where I can actually start adding the letters to them. So for the past few days, just book work. And once again, I'm not the best photographer, so my motherfucking picture, man, some of the titles of the books are blurry and I can't read everything, which is cool. So I'm just going to use my artistic liberations to create whatever books I want to add in there where I can't really define the lettering in the paintings. And I do that in all my Reader series anyway, because sometimes I'll make up this one book and it recurs in a lot of my Reader series, and the title of the book is 9/11 was an inside job. And so you'll see that on the bookshelves a lot, like in this painting. There's a book here that was titled 9/11 was an inside job. Oh shit. So of course I'll throw that in there again. And sometimes I use books for subliminals. So if somebody actually reads all the books, they'll find like little hidden secrets in there. So that's my task for today, is lettering. This is shit. Hey yo, this shit's gonna be boring as fuck, just letting you know right now, bro. Y'all some true motherfucking nerds. Up early in the morning watching some dude paint some books. I don't know what's wrong with you, but I like it. You know what I'm saying? Y'all special. Alright. Let's just do this shit, yeah. Try to see where I'm gonna start at. I've really been bouncing around a lot, but that's actually gonna be too high. maybe if I might have to get like that for a bit. Oh yeah, and if you guys are on social media, or if you know your kids or somebody's on social media, definitely go to my Instagram, or tell them to go to my Instagram and share the advertisements for my brush holders on your social media, on your Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever. I haven't put this on Twitter yet. I don't think. I might catch a couple of sales off Twitter. But yeah, help your boy advertise the Prince brush holder. Free advertisement is so dope. You never know, man. You never know. You share that shit one time on your social media sites, hey, the right motherfucker might see that shit. Wow, it's so hard to see this fucking picture. Hey. I gotta get better with photography. I actually want a better lens. If I can get me a nice ass, like a portrait lens, or like a wide angle lens, I think they're called. If I can get one of them Jones, I can do like I say in this picture, I would be able to have her in focus and have a better focus on the background, which would make it easier for me to read the books on the shelves. That's why I tell people, like, they'll send me a picture and I'm like, yeah, but it looks nice small, but when I blow that shit up and try to look at the details and see the finer details in the image, like, I'm not going to be able to do it because the quality of the picture is too low. The resolution is too low. And some people think, oh, you can just, like, get any picture and paint that shit and make it look good. Like, now if that shit gonna be looking pixelated like a goddamn 1990s video game, like, I can't work from that shit.
And this represents the best we can do to try to come up with a tentative, evidence-based understanding of reality. Counts as good evidence, though. Not just what counts as evidence. We can take all the little pieces of the puzzle, all the bits of information that we're trying to explain. The facts that we're trying to explain are not the evidence. So there's a fact, which is a change in the allele frequency over time. That evolution as a factual observation occurs. Things change. Then the question then becomes, hey, do they change enough to warrant, to support speciation? And yes, we see evidence for that. And we start to try and, well, what is the explanation for this? What's the best way to describe this? And for the longest time, we may not know. And we may not have a complete model, but what we need to do is, if you have a model that is actually the explanation for the observations, it needs to account for all the facts, it needs to be testable, replicatable, falsifiable. That's science. And before Ben or anybody else tries to say, well, Matt's advocating for scientism, yeah, I pretty much am, but not necessarily in the way that so many people think so. I'm just in the position that I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. And that means I must have in place the mechanisms that mean I'm most likely to get it right and least likely to get it wrong. It would be an interesting exercise, and maybe this is what we should do instead of a debate at a future time, for Ben and I to list 100 things we believe in, and ensuring that 50 of them are things we're reasonably confident that the other person also believes, and that 50 of them are at least dubious. Maybe we don't need 100, but that might be way too much work for either one of us, but if we could list 10 things where there's 5 things that I'm really confident Ben and I both believes, and there's 5 things that I believe that I think he may not, and then look at our processes for reaching the conclusion that we are confident in those beliefs, not that we're not that we have knowledge, not that we are certain. I don't think you can be absolutely certain about anything, but to talk about how and why we came to believe those positions, and to present the evidence for those positions where we disagree. What I find curious is that anytime I've attempted to do this, it's only things like astrology, psychics, lucky socks, where people are saying, these things are real, despite the fact that we don't have good evidence that they are. And they would look at it and say, I read my horoscope in the newspaper today. Clearly astrology has something to it because that was really impactful for me. When they don't understand that one of the things that we need to do is get away from your personal interpretation and understanding of what your experiences are. While you are the best one to decide whether or not you're hungry right now, you may not be the best one to decide that the experience that you have is best attributed to the divine or to aliens or whatever the explanation is. That explanation needs more. And so if the evidence for God tends to be anecdotal, unverifiable, in conflict with other beliefs, that's a problem. If it's a hearsay account that doesn't give us the possibility of investigating it, when we're deciding, like, if you talk to a district attorney whether or not they're deciding to bring a case, they're going to evaluate the evidence, and they're going to decide whether or not they have enough evidence to make the case. And when it comes to something like God, not only do I not think there's enough evidence to convict, I don't think there's enough evidence to even bring the case. What we have are testimonial accounts. I fully acknowledge there's anecdotal evidence in the billions from believers. And I'm a former believer. I used to have a Jesus hat I could put on here around a little bit to swap back and forth and put on my old hat. I used to believe those things. And when I stopped believing, it wasn't because I got mad at God. It wasn't because I decided, I want to go sin. It wasn't for any reason other than I don't see an evidence-based, valid argument for the existence of God. And as I looked around and asked, nobody could give me one. And as I run around doing more and more debates with people, it has yet to materialize. And today, and again, no offense to Ben, we're going to have a conversation, and hopefully we get to it, but there was not even an attempt. I mean, granted, I don't view debates as winning. Like somebody was like, did you win the debate? I don't know. I don't care. If you're looking at debates as who won, I think you have kind of the wrong look on this. I want to actually have the conversation. Do I think I've won a debate? Sure. Under whatever criteria someone might have, I think I've lost. Sure. But the important thing is, if we're going to have a debate, if this was a collegiate score debate, it would already be over because Ben didn't present positive evidence or even an argument for the actual proposition. And I don't care. And I don't want anybody in chat to go like, Ben didn't show up with it. That's irrelevant. Ben believes something that I don't. And we're having a conversation for the rest of this time, along with questions, about why he believes and why he thinks I should believe. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe Ben does not, I don't want to make any assumptions, maybe he does not believe that I should be convinced for the reasons that he is. But all I can do when somebody thinks they have good evidence is to say, show me the good evidence, let's have a conversation about the good evidence, and I will tell you why I think it is good evidence, or perhaps why I think it's not good evidence. And maybe that convinces some people, but as it stands right now, I don't have anything to work with. So.
You got it. Thank you very much. We will kick it right in.
What's going on, everyone? Ben Hess here with Adobe Stock and Epidemic Sound. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to choose the right music for your project.
An open dialogue. So the floor is all yours, gentlemen.
Okay. Well, Matt, I agree that we're coming at this from the standpoint, more from a discussion standpoint than a collegiate debate. And so my intent, as I stated at the outset of my original opening statement, was twofold. Number one, I believe that there are not good from religious skepticism to show that God doesn't exist. And number two, that I also happen to believe that there are several good arguments, and one in particular that I'll employ for this evening, to show that God does exist. And so my opening statement merely was for the purpose of setting the first point in that twofold approach.
I'm wondering if we could agree that it's not up to anybody to prove that there isn't a God, that until such time as there's a good justification, belief in a God isn't warranted. Like, it's not like you're justified in believing in God until I prove it wrong. Nobody's justified in believing anything, including a God proposition, until they have a good argument for it and evidence.
To allow that to be the grounds for discussion, religious discussion and inquiry into the subject of God's existence in the context of this discussion. So I think that that's a good place for us to begin.
So how do we start? And like you say you have one argument, and I'm sure you have many, and I'm sure you have lots of good reasons, but you have one in particular. I have no idea why it wasn't presented in the opening, but I'm happy for you to present it now so that we can discuss it.
Sure. I think that one of the very strong arguments for the existence of God is something that I refer to as the axiomatic argument for God's existence. This is very much like the ontological argument for God's existence, the argument for God from his being, but it asserts a slightly different point. The purpose of the axiomatic argument for God's existence is to show that God exists in every single world that we might conceive of to exist, and this would include all possible worlds that we might imagine. And as it turns out, because the concept of God, at least at the conceptual level, is entirely unraceable on strong grounds, I think, that therefore we're not in a position to airbrush a causal beginning to any world that we might imagine for the sake of any argument. That's just simply not rational to do so. And so,
what's the argument?
The argument essentially, I might refer to it as the ever-pending birthday. Imagine that you, Matt Dillahunty, have walked into a room only to encounter an infinite row of tumbling dominoes. Each falling tile collapses a subsequent member, causing the preceding domino to plummet towards the earth. And each successive domino takes all of 1 second to accomplish its inevitable collision with the floor. And now imagine that the row of dominoes is utterly beginningless, leading to a final domino standing near your foot. Bending down, you notice that the domino bears an inscription which reads the exact date of your birth. And so you then begin to wonder, if the set of dominoes is infinitely long, how much time will it take for my birthday domino to collapse? And of course the answer is unavoidable. The tile would never fall. Consequently, that would imply that you could never be born. And so this means that in any world that we imagine, none of these worlds can be eternal in the past. Some initial trigger has to set the world in motion. And so this essentially means that the initial cause that brought the world that we live in into existence, any finite cause itself requires some sort of a causal parent. And so therefore, since the cause that triggered the other causes, we have to inquire into what is the founding reason for this. If the reason is something which lies outside of the cause itself, then it, and not the cause, is the real reason why the world exists. And so the parent cause of the world necessarily causes itself to cause the other causes to be set in motion. And this seems to imply a conscious will at work in the world of really any world that we might imagine. It seems that this would apply to the world of the Swiss Family Robinson, as well as to the world that we're having this discussion in right now. And so because that concept seems unerasable to me, it seems to me that we are stuck with God's existence as a matter of a sheer axiom. That is a self-evident, irreducible prime that we're never justified in questioning. So that's really convincing.
I started by saying this was a version of the ontological argument, and I don't care what category we put it in, but everything about it, for me, reads as a first cause argument and not an ontological argument. That it has nothing to do with necessarily the characteristics of a God, but instead a fictional, one-directionally infinite timeline. So, first of all, to the extent that we know and understand time and causality, it seems to be contained within the universe that we inhabit, and that universe, by the best physics and cosmology that I'm aware of, began somewhere around 13.7 billion years ago, and that time began with that. So talking about time prior to this is already nonsensical. And so if you were to talk about something that stretched infinitely into the past, granted, Carl Sagan pointed out that he had an objection when somebody said, if we don't stop at some point, stop asking what came before this, then we might never stop. And Carl Sagan famously was like, well, then why stop? But the thing is, this set of
argument of infinitism.
Well, the thing is that same infinitism exists in the Zeno's arrow paradox, which you don't have to go you don't have to start with my birthday and try and go back forever. All you have to do is say that 1 minute before I was born, there's an infinite amount of time in between that time and now that you would have to cross. And you would have to, in order to cross the first half a second, you'd have to cross the first quarter of a second, you'd have to cross the first eighth of a second, the 16th, and this goes on. That there's an infinity between these. And here's the problem, is that every time we're trying, I understand that some mathematicians will talk about different types of infinities they can use, but generally speaking, infinity is not a quantity. It is a concept for a lack of a quantity. So when you try to construct this thing and say, well, if that line of dominoes went on forever into the past, which I don't even know how that's remotely possible, because the best of science doesn't say that the past is infinite.
I would agree, it's not.
Just that we are one directionally infinite into the future from the instant of the beginning. But
yes.
if what you're arguing is true, is God eternal?
Well, I think that there are several things that I would like to point out, and that is that in the case of Zeno's paradox, the length of space, the spatial extent between the one end of the stadium to the other, is actually conceptually prior to our subdivisions of it into infinite segments. And so, therefore, the point is that the line itself is finite in duration, however we might divide the actual line itself. And so, yes, of course, I would admit that it's true that you can subdivide any finite space into infinite amounts. Of course, that's true in one sense.
But it still means you can't get there. So what I'm asking is God infinite? Is God...
I think that essentially...
Does God have a beginning?
Well, and here I would admit...
Wait, you think God had a beginning?
Well, I think that what I'm saying is that I would admit that if it is the case that God himself has persisted through an infinite sequence of temporal events, that God himself falls on the same sword, so to speak, as the universe does, or any world that we might imagine. But I don't think that that's the argument necessarily. I think that the way that Christians typically think of God is existing in a sort of a temporal now. If we could imagine God's thoughts being brought down into a room that you and I are standing in, what we discover is that those thoughts could not be arranged in a chronological sequence. And that's because all of God's thoughts exist to him in a present eternal now. And so God does not experience a temporal sequence of events in himself. Therefore, the problem disappears in the case of a first cause. And so I think that that's a pretty good response to the questions that you raised.
Well, the question I asked is, does God have a beginning? And you seem to say yes.
No, I'm not saying that God has a beginning.
That's what confused me, because you went on this thing after I asked you, because does God have a beginning? So
no, I'm not saying that. Sorry if it drew that impression.
Well, I mean, you literally said yes, but I think you were thinking about something else, which is why I wanted to clarify it. So the fact that Christians have a particular notion of God existing outside of time, as if our timeline is just a function within God, that's cool. I don't know how you prove it. And when you talk about God in the sense that God must exist in all possible worlds, I don't know how you prove that either, because so far, I asked a couple times.
Okay.
I'm waiting for the actual, does your argument have premises and conclusion? Because I have yet to hear that, and I was want to write it down so I address your argument accurately. So what is it?
Sure. Well, I would say that the proof that this is true is the fact that it's axiomatic.
Okay, no. Axioms, you don't, the fact that something's axiomatic does not prove that it's true. An axiom is something that you assume is true as a matter of necessity, a sort of presupposition, or something you assume is true for the sake of the argument. What I asked was, does your argument, and does it have a formal structure with premises and conclusion?
Well, my understanding is that essentially an axiomatic argument is part of several types of arguments that essentially issue from an argument called foundationalism. Foundationalism historically has taken on two essential forms, that of presuppositionalism and that of axiomatic arguments. Presuppositions are things that we presuppose for the purposes of testing what follows, whether or not certain things follow or not. Well, axioms are things that are self-evidently true. In other words, the evidence is in the sheer pronouncement of the proposition itself. 2 + 2 = 4. A plus B is equal to B plus A. These are the axioms of mathematics, and there are logical axioms as well.
So the answer to my question, then, I'm going to assume, is that no, your argument does not have set premises and a conclusion for me to write down.
Well, I think that I walked out a simple illustration that demonstrates the necessity of there being an axiomatic beginning to any universe that we might possibly imagine. It doesn't matter if you're the guy who's been sort of a computer has stolen your brain, disposed of all the postcranial content, and has inserted you into a tube in the matrix. That matrix world necessarily has a first cause. Every single world that we imagine has this cause, and this is therefore a matter of an axiom. It's not something that we can airbrush out of our picture of any world that we might imagine. And so it is something that is inescapably to be dealt with as A plus B is equal to B plus A, or that you and I equal 2, whether we're standing in heaven, earth, or in hell. It doesn't matter. You and I equal 2. So and it's asking for proof to something like that. It seems like a strange request. It seems
no, it doesn't seem a strange request at all. There's nothing strange about the request at all. So mathematics is directly derived from the foundations of logic, and it's not 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not an axiom. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is based on axiomatic foundations of mathematics.
Yes, it is.
And notions of regularity. But those are things that are still regarded as true, but not demonstrated as true. If we could demonstrate they were true, they wouldn't be called axioms. Now, the axioms that are around that result in 2 plus 2 equals 4, the conclusions from those are things that we can demonstrate to consistently be reliably true. Neither one of us are going to say, 1 plus 1 equals 73. We're probably not going to say that unless we have some really peculiar root-based system of math with different operands. But if we're talking about normative quantities, then that's where we're at. However, to say why does 1 plus 1 equals 2 is something that we can actually work towards and demonstrate. Just like...
I would agree with that.
The fact that non-contradiction and excluded middle are presuppositions which we cannot demonstrate, but which we assume are true and appear to be uniformly absolutely true in the sense that they appear to be inviolate, that you would have to assume they were true to try to prove they weren't true. And I don't know what you would have to assume in order to try to prove them false, but you'd have to come up with some way of justifying that. It's not just...
That's precisely my point. That's what this argument is like for God's existence, is that
that's not an argument for God's existence. The fact that we assume something to be true is not an argument that it is true, and it's certainly not evidence that it is true. In fact,
it's not an argument in the sense...
Hang on. The fact that we assume something as a necessity is because we do not have good evidence for it. If we have good evidence for it, we don't need to assume it. We just demonstrate it. So if your entire case is axiomatic, then you're acknowledging there is no good evidence for God, or at least there's no good evidence going to be presented for God, because if there's good evidence, we don't need to assume.
I don't really think that that's true, and let me explain to you why. Because essentially my epistemology is founded upon the work of an 2nd century Greek philosopher known as Sextus Empiricus, who was an early critic of Plato's teaching. And Sextus essentially held that there were only one of 3 possible options whenever trying to settle the contingent status of proposition, call it whatever it is. And essentially those 3 possibilities were the argument of infinitism, the argument of coherentism, and the argument of foundationalism, which axiomatic argument certainly would be fall under a type of foundationalism. And so if you're saying that isn't good evidence, well, the other 2 possibilities aren't good evidence either. Infinitism doesn't work because, say that you have proposition A, how is A proven? Well, presumably by B. How's B? With a very, very powerful question. How do you settle the contingent status of Z? Well, yes.
Ben, you locked up for about 15, 20 seconds there, so I want to make sure your video is still locked up. We can hear you on audio, so I want to make sure you said that because I couldn't hear what you said. You are back now. What was okay. Say it again.
Okay. Yes, I was simply pointing out that there were 3 possible ways to attempt to settle the contingent status of any proposition that we might be discussing, according to the early Greek philosopher Sextus Empiricus, who held that the first possibility was infinitism. If we're trying to say, how do we settle the contingent status of proposition A, presumably you say A is proven by B, B is proven by C, C is proven by D, and so on and so forth until you reach contingent proposition Z. But what happens when you reach Z? how do you settle the contingent status of Z? Well, the infinitist argument essentially says that you prove Z on the basis of contingent proposition A1. And A1 is proven by B1, B1 is proven by C1, so on and so forth until you read Z1. But now you've got the same problem. And it goes back and basically onwards and onwards forever. That doesn't seem to prove anything. And so if you don't like door number 1, where do you go? Sextus Empiricus said you go to door number 2, and that's the argument of coherentism. Coherentism essentially says that we should have perhaps decided to do something different when we reached contingent proposition C. In other words, when we reached Z, we probably should have said something like, well, Z is proven by Y. But how's that different from saying that Z is proven by A? And that raises the question of whether or not circular reasoning is valid. This is often where scientific discussion goes. If we wish to say, well, how do you know that's true to a scientist? The scientist just simply takes the warrant for the proof and tosses it back to some previous member of the set. Well, at least all the proofs are coherent with one another, and that forms a better resolution to our original inquiry into A than the idea that nothing can be proven, which is where infinitism leads you. So if neither of these two options works, well, then you've always got door number 3, and that's the argument of foundationalism. Foundationalism essentially says that Z could have proven by just simply saying, well, Z is settled. Now, there are two historic forms that foundationalism has essentially taken. The first would be that of presuppositionalism, and the second is by axiomatic arguments. And so presuppositions are simply blindly presupposed, but axioms are self-evidently true. Take Sextus Empiricus' argument, for example. Isn't it the case that it's axiomatically true that the only way to settle the contingent status of Z is by either going to A prime, Y, or Z itself, just simply saying at Z, either you go backward this way or you stay. And so that's axiomatically true. And so therefore, it is on the basis of these kinds of demonstrations that we can know whether or not something is settled, final sense. If you're going to argue for coherentism, that doesn't work because it begs the problem of circular reasoning. And anyway, if you're going to go that direction, coherentism seems to collapse to a form of foundationalism. So the scientist is essentially saying, well, I foundationally believe that all of my empirical deliverances are true, but isn't that just a form of foundationalism? So then what's wrong with the Christian's evidence? So if those are the only 3 live options we have in terms of what types of evidence we can choose from, well, certainly I would say that Sextus Empiricus' arguments are so persuasive that most modern philosophers have essentially said that they're almost irresistible.
Except
And
that,
to me, I find that to be true.
well, so this is an interesting topic that I've had lots of conversations with, except it has nothing to do with whether or not there's good evidence for God. And instead of just relying on Sextus, I've actually looked into things a little bit further and more modern. I don't know if you're familiar with Susan Haack, who's come up with a thing that she calls foundherentism, which is an epistemology that combines principles of foundationalism with coherentism. I don't know what the defeater is. I don't know what the defeater is for that. It seems to be the most consistent, the view that is most consistent with the way that I go about things. However, at the end of the day, I'm a scientific skeptic. What I want is evidence. I don't want somebody to tell me God is axiomatic, because clearly, like if I were to tell you no God, that the notion that God exists is axiomatic, you would reject that. So there must be some reason for opting for is axiomatic. But the second you do that, you're saying there isn't good evidence for God, or I'm not aware of good evidence for God, because if there is evidence for it, you don't take it as an axiom. There's evidence for DNA testing. I don't have to take it as axiomatic that DNA testing works. It is evidence-based. And if in fact there is a God, I'll have questions about God. Does the God that you're advocating, can that God within the material world in a way that is detectable?
So, I don't see why not. He's God.
I don't see why not either. But if God is detectable, then you don't need an axiom. What you need is evidence. So yes, what is something that God can do that we can empirically verify?
Yeah, I would say that miracles would be an example of this, but getting back to the argument for God's existence, I think that you could easily force any sign, wonder, or miracle that you see into an infinite regress of proofs. No reason not to. You've got that option, or you can just simply try to argue from some other presupposed basis of coherence.
It'd be really great if you didn't spend nearly so much time trying to anticipate what my objection's going to be and just have the discussion. entire opening was an anticipation of what you thought a religious skeptic was going to say. It literally had nothing to do with my position or this debate at all. And now I'm asking, can God do something in reality that is detectable? And you say, yes, miracles, but before I can even start to talk about this, you're immediately anticipating what objections are going to be. Identify some miracle that we can reasonably attribute to a God.
Well, you're asking for a miracle that you and I can reasonably attribute to God. I'm assuming that you want a miracle that happens right in front of us.
I'd love for you to give any example of any miracle. Because I hear lots of claims about miracles. I have yet to hear about any miracle that has actually been verified.
It's actually been verified.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the arguments for the resurrection of Jesus are fairly
The resurrection of Jesus hasn't been verified.
That depends on what you are demanding as a reasonable grounds for verification.
So,
and I think that essentially the problem that I see is that in many cases, and I don't know if this is the case with you, so I won't suppose on the front end that this is the way that you see things, but many atheists and skeptics seem to suggest that that all these arguments from history, historical arguments, are based on induction.
I promise, I'm trying to be as patient as I can. Please stop debating other atheists that aren't here and have the conversation with the one that's here. I'm not here to defend what other atheists believe. All I've asked is provide evidence for a miracle, and you are now talking about what other atheists believe. How is that relevant to you providing evidence for a miracle?
No one picks up a ball wanting to change the world. They want to escape it.
Sure. Well, I think that the evidence for the miracle of the resurrection is fairly strong because it's been historically substantiated, and that's good enough, it seems. Otherwise, it seems
seriously,
to me...
Now, I want to make sure we're clear, because there's a soundbite right there where I asked you for a miracle, and your statement is the evidence for the resurrection is historical, and that's good enough for you. You didn't provide any evidence. You just, once again, told me what you're convinced of. How can I? And I swear I'm not trying to be obtuse. I am here as a lost soul, according to your notion. According to your religious view, which I don't really know particularly well, I'm going to guess that I am desperately in need of the truth about Jesus, or my soul is damned to elimination or hell. I don't know if you believe in a literal hell or what. And yet, when I ask you to provide evidence for a miracle, your answer is the resurrection, historically confirmed enough to suit you.
Yes, I think it's. Okay. I think it should.
Then I don't know what we have to talk about. Because you're not presenting any evidence in your opening, you're not presenting any evidence in this discussion, you're just once again restating that you are in fact convinced of something.
I haven't gotten around to saying particularly what the evidence is. I can.
We've been debating for almost an hour. The whole purpose of the debate was to present evidence for God. How could you possibly say I have? Because that seems ridiculous.
No, I do believe that I've gotten around to the notion that I think we have a good reason to suppose on the basis of an axiomatic demonstration that God exists. That's the topic for tonight's discussion, and that's what I've come ready to speak into.
But you haven't presented any evidence, and you're wanting to accept it axiomatically, which means that now we're not even having a debate.
Oh, I would say that the other two options that we have in the trilemma I just mentioned are unfavorable, and I think that perhaps you would say that that's true as well.
The trilemma you just talked about, infinitism, coherentism, and foundationism, are about epistemology. They are not about a God.
Sure,
you've barely spoken. You have barely spoken about a God. And now when I say, where's the evidence? You say, well, there's only those three possibilities. Well, first of all, I already acknowledged that maybe there aren't. I don't care if you see any others. I just pointed you to Susan Hawkes' found-herentism. But in the end of the day, no matter which epistemological model you use, there's either evidence for a God or there's not. And there's either good evidence for a God or there's not. Are you ever planning to present good evidence for a God, which was the purpose of this debate?
that essentially what I've come into this discussion to do is to simply show that there are good reasons to believe that God exists, and that I think that axiomatic demonstrations are the strongest form of
then I have nothing more to
that
say,
we
because
could have.
if we didn't agree on a debate of, hey, can I come up with a good reason to believe in a God? And the only thing that I have to do is say that I'm convinced it's good. The issue here under debate was, is there good evidence for God? If we're not going to talk about
does
evidence,
depend on the type of evidence that you're willing to
it doesn't
accept.
matter what evidence depends on, you have to actually present it. If I'm not going to present evidence for the existence of God, then we should have had a debate about epistemology, which I'm happy to do. I just did a couple of weeks ago. If I would agree to do a debate on epistemology, then we could discuss that. But if you're going to say, I'm going to come in and debate Matt Dillany on whether or not there's good evidence for God, and I'm not going to present any evidence, good or otherwise, and I'm just going to say that it's axiomatic, and that I don't see anything newer or more reliable than what a second century Greek thought about epistemology. I don't know what to say. There's nothing more to do. My job here is to point out why I either accept or reject your evidence. But if you're not going to present evidence, then we're wasting time, and might as well just go to questions.
This might be an interesting question to ask, is what is the reason to suppose that an axiomatic demonstration is somehow a faulty reason or suspect reason to believe in the existence of God?
It needs to be supported by evidence. And so you could take, there's no God belief that one could propose that one couldn't accept axiomatically. Axiomatically accept Allah, Yahweh, whatever model Scientology is. It doesn't even have to be a God. I can axiomatically accept any one of those. I'm concerned with whether or not there's evidence and whether or not there's good evidence. And I was told that I was coming to a debate about whether or not there's good evidence, and now you're not presenting any good or otherwise and saying that it's unnecessary because it being axiomatic is enough. Now, if something's axiomatic,
Seems that that's true.
If something's axiomatic, there's no debate.
Well, I think that you would be in a position to say whether or not you agree that that type of demonstration is good enough to persuade you, Matt Dillahunty, for the existence of a God, that since it seems that we don't have a good grounds for launching an argument which says that this isn't true, and I don't think that I've heard one, then I would say...
You already agreed. You don't get to do this. You don't get to say you haven't heard an argument against God when we already established at the outset and you agreed that the burden of proof is on you.
No,
to prove there is
no. I think that it's best to say that in any discussion, one way or the other, I do not view the standpoint of atheism as being something that is somehow epistemically...
Well, I'm sorry. I'm defending my position. The debate here is that you either have good evidence for the existence of God, which I then either acknowledge is good evidence, or I say it's not good evidence and here's why. But I'm not in any position where I'm required to prove that a God doesn't exist. Both in real life, with the fact of me being an atheist and putting the burden of proof where it's supposed to be, based on proper epistemology. However, in this debate, the debate is there good evidence? Now, I'm going to ask this just one last time, and then maybe we'll just go on to questions from the audience. Are you going to present actual evidence for a God?
I think that I have shown that there are three possibilities, three major possibilities, and I already did mention the combination of coherentism and foundationalism in my explanation. And I think I said that there are these three possibilities that we might entertain on how to establish evidence of any kind, or some sort of a demonstration of any kind. I think this is a fairly good one. It seems to me that it's fairly strong. I haven't heard any good arguments against it. And so I think that because it seems to stand up the way that it does to questioning, that's a fairly sturdy grounds for believing that God exists.
Okay.
Yeah.
Congrats. But you've presented no evidence.
Maybe.
And
well, I
if
think
the debate is about good evidence, you don't just get to say it's axiomatic. That's not what evidence is.
I think that this is one form of evidence that we have to choose from. We have to choose from one of the three. And we don't have any other options.
So you keep you're so obsessed. You are so obsessed. You are so obsessed over these three categories of epistemology, despite the fact that they may or may not be exhaustive, that it doesn't matter which one of those is true.
Is enough to say.
Wow. It doesn't matter which one of those is true, or even if there's another option or not. Whatever epistemology.
I don't think that doesn't seem like there is.
Am I going to be able to finish?
I apologize. Please do finish.
You know, I let you talk for a long time, and I got nothing. No evidence, just, hey, there's only three ways to look at knowledge. And it can't be this, and it can't be this, therefore God is axiomatic. Well, first of all, that's not an argument. You presented no argument with no structure. And in a debate about whether or not there's good evidence, you presented no evidence and just asserted it's axiomatic. So, I mean, I don't look at debates as win-lose, but this is a lose for you under all the criteria of the debate. Because I came in to debate, is there good evidence for God? And you came in to say, there isn't, but it's axiomatic. Okay, congrats.
I think that this is a good and persuasive argument, and I think, as I said at the beginning, as you agreed in your presentation, that we weren't having some sort of a formal debate. We were just two people that were talking about things that we believed, and that's essentially what I'm presenting here. I don't.
Yeah, but the topic wasn't. Sorry, I interrupted. I apologize.
Oh no, you can go ahead and speak. I'm willing to.
The debate wasn't, is there a persuasive argument for God? If somebody had contacted me and said, Matt, we'd like you as an atheist to come in and argue that there are no persuasive arguments for God, I would have said, no, that's stupid. Of course there are persuasive arguments for God. There are persuasive arguments for anything. There's a persuasive argument for the flat earth, but we know that's not true. There's a persuasive argument for countless things. I care about what's truth. And truth is based, when we have demonstrable, identifiable truth, it is rooted in evidence supporting it. Not, is there a persuasive argument? I can make persuasive arguments for almost anything, especially if I find exactly the right audience. But if there's good evidence, that's a different story.
Perhaps our discussion could be held by your saying what counts as good evidence. I
talked about this. I addressed this a little bit in my opening remark about what sort of evidence should be good, and that should explain the available facts entirely, and that there shouldn't be exceptions for it, and that it should not lead to multiple different conclusions that are similarly or equally justified, but that I can't tell you, here is the standard for good evidence for any individual claim until we've assessed the nature of that claim, and then my job is someone presents evidence and I tell them either here's why that is good evidence or here's why I don't consider that good evidence. But if my interlocutor is not going to present any evidence, then I have nothing to work with. Of the two of us, I'm the only one that actually talked about some criteria for good evidence.
Yes, so then I take it that you're saying... Oh, yes, please, our moderator.
This might be a good chance to move into the Q&A. Otherwise, if we have maybe... I'm open to it if you guys want to have like one last back and forth in the sense of like maybe a minute or two each, just to conclude. Do you have a strong opinion either way?
I'm good. If there's questions, I'm good for moving on to it. I think, honestly, and this is no offense to Ben, I don't care Ben any will, but I think we're going to sit here and keep repeating ourselves over and over again because Ben's not in a position tonight to come forward with specifically good evidence for equality, and I'm not ready to, this late in the game, talk about, have an epistemology debate.
If the evidence is such that it could be, forced into an infinite regress of questions, then I would say that that's bad evidence. This demonstration that I've given is not like this. If it is something that merely is just self-coherent with itself, but pays no attention to iterating questions, then that just seems to be coherentism, and that isn't very persuasive evidence either. So it seems
coherentism isn't evidence, it's an epistemology. It's like you don't know what evidence is. You say coherentism
epistemology is our philosophy of knowledge, and certainly it deals with the chains of evidence.
It processes evidence. It's not the evidence. And you just referred to coherentism saying it's not good evidence or it's not evidence.
Yes, if something is of the variety of coherentism, then I don't think that that's very good evidence.
I don't think it's evidence at all. But
the argument under discussion, if it somehow is is playing well as a coherentist argument, if that's what it looks like, then it doesn't matter how persuasive the evidence empirically seems. It's just it's going to lead to more questions, and to me, that the strongest possible evidence that we could have would be axiomatic evidence. Now, on the basis of an axiom, suppose that P is an axiom, and then we build P directly implies Q. Q is not an axiom, but it's rooted. It's the anchoring proposition, so to speak, is an axiom. That's a good argument. I would say that's a good argument. But I don't know that short of something like that, we could say that the evidence for the existence of God would be good evidence. And so that's my point. I simply mention these various competing epistemologies to simply show that the best type of evidence, the strongest type, what we could call good evidence, would necessarily have as its anchoring proposition something that is axiomatic. I think that that would be important to our discussion. I think that it is relevant. Now, that's my opinion, and I'm certainly willing to discuss it, and I know that we can talk about it. I'm willing to entertain a couple more questions, but if Matt feels frustrated by all of this, I guess I have been accused at times of asking too many questions.
Well, it'd be nice if you presented slightly more answers. I mean, if we're going to have a debate about whether or not there's good evidence, to simply show up and say that it's self-evident that God exists, that's not good evidence. And for you to claim that something that's self-evident is the best evidence, because it's not self-evident that God exists. And by the way, you presented no argument. You've presented no argument that God is in fact self-evident. All you've done is assert that God is self-evident. And
I don't think so. I've shown the basis of the impossibility of an infinite regress.
You haven't demonstrated that, though. You haven't demonstrated the possibility of an infinite regress. You didn't even really dig in on it. You didn't show that a God is necessary to get out of it. And we talked about time beginning with the origin of the universe, and all you want to do is then special plead and say, but there's a God. Whatever. Let's go on to questions, I guess.
We can jump into questions. Want to say thanks for your questions, folks. We will try to get through every one that we can. Forgive us if we don't get through every single one, but we're going to try to move fast. Marcos Makoyevi, let me know if I mispronounced it, friend. Thanks so much for your super sticker. And then Clyde Sesites, thank you for your question. Said, Matt, if abiogenesis was ever proven impossible to you, could you see this as proof of a creator God behind the creation of the first biological life?
So I don't know how you would prove that abiogenesis is impossible, and it would need to be that the nature of that disproof or showing that abiogenesis is impossible necessarily leaves only a God as an option, because the fact that you were somehow able to demonstrate that life can't arise from non-life, that doesn't mean that you can show that life arose from non-life by means of magic. It has to be something else. All of these things that want to appeal to God as if it's the only explanation left is just a failure of human imagination and creativity. It is, I can't think of anything better than a God did it, and science hasn't been able to show us anything better than God did it. As a matter of fact, it doesn't look like this is possible, and since it apparently happened, it must be God. That is actually a fallacious argument. So no, I'm not going to be convinced as God. What will convince me of a God is actual positive evidence for the proposition. It's like if we found out tomorrow that evolution was completely fiction. That doesn't mean that God created life or its diversity. That is a separate proposition that needs evidence for it. I would agree that if we showed that abiogenesis is impossible, that it might make it seem like that there's a God that's more likely. The problem is that to assume that you've demonstrated you have eliminated all possibilities, or something like this, something like abiogenesis, would almost require you to be omniscient. That's not the way knowledge and understanding works. So, you know what? These fictional scenarios, these hypothetical things of being like, if we lopped off somebody's head and they put their head back on and came walking in, would you say that God resurrected them? Or if something wrote, "I am the Lord thy God" in the moon so that everybody could see it, or if we could prove that abiogenesis can't happen. Call me when something like that happens, because I'm not convinced that it's possible to demonstrate that abiogenesis is impossible.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And thanks for your question. This one comes from Stupid Horror Energy Strikes Again, saying,
Stupid Horror Energy. Wow, that's rough.